Hi, good afternoon. I'm Dave Phillips, the director of the Center for IDEA Fiscal Reporting. We are a OSEP-funded technical assistance center that provides technical assistance to state agency staff around the Part B and Part C fiscal requirements. I'm very pleased to be today's moderator for our large group panel session. This is our Part B and C fiscal spotlight session that's titled American Rescue Plan Funds, Maximizing Opportunities Through the Appropriate Use of Funds for Part B and Part C Programs. We have 4 groups of panelists today that we'll be working with over the next 90 minutes. So what I'm going to do in terms of time, we have a pretty packed agenda. I'm going to walk through what the agenda looks like, as well as introductions simultaneously for our 4 groups. And then I'll spend a few minutes on some housekeeping matters, and then we'll dive right in. So to kick us off today, we're going to have 2 colleagues from the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education that will talk about American Rescue Plan funds in general, those primarily distributed through the Elementary and Secondary Education Act Title I process and the appropriate uses that are available when thinking about providing supports for infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disabilities and their families. They'll kick us off, and that will be Britt Young. She's a program lead for the Office of State and Grantee Relations within OESE. She'll be joined by her colleague, Diane Rentner, who's an education program specialist and policy lead for the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief, Governor's Emergency Education Relief, and the Emergency Assistance to Non-Public School Programs. They'll be presenting for about 15 minutes. We'll have a 5-minute question and answer after their presentation. Then we'll transition to Jennifer Finch, who is a fiscal accountability facilitator for the Office of Special Education Programs. Jennifer is going to share with us some of the specific requirements surrounding the $3 billion or so that are being distributed through the IDEA allocation process of ARP funds. After that 15-minute presentation, we'll have another 5-minute Q&A, and then we'll really get into the heart of our panel today, which is getting the perspectives of sort of on-the-ground implementation of utilizing the American Rescue Plan funds from the state perspective. We have from Alabama's Part C program, Amy Blakeney, the Part C coordinator and director of the Early Intervention System within the Alabama Department of Rehabilitation Services. She'll be joined by her colleagues in Alabama, Felicia Carswell, the Assistant Part C Coordinator, Brandy Brown, the Contracts, Grants, and Training Specialist within their department, and Tanya Gandy, the Data Manager and Child Find Director. The Alabama folks will be providing a 15-minute presentation on how they have been thinking about utilizing the ARP funds so far and their stakeholder engagement processes. We'll have a 5-minute Q&A, and then finally we'll transfer to the state of Kansas, who will be providing us with a Part B perspective. And to do that, we have Dean Zeitz, the State and Federal Programs Coordinator for the Special Education and Title Services team within the Kansas State Department of Education, and he'll be joined by his colleague, Christy Weiler, a fiscal consultant with the department who works with both IDEA and ESEA requirements. Like the rest of the program, we'll have a 15-minute presentation, 5 minutes of Q&A, and then we'll have an overall panel discussion for the remaining 10 minutes if we can stay on schedule. So a little bit of the housekeeping I talked about too before we dive in. This is a unique experience for us as panelists. We're in a separate room from participants, so we have no audience interaction. So we're doing our level best to sort of be able to present to you in an engaging way. But we don't have the audience feedback that I think a lot of us have grown accustomed to over the last year and a half with the virtual platforms. So as you put chats into the participant platform, those are filtered through to me as those will be filtered through to me in a chat in my platform, and I'll get to as many questions as we can during our question and answer times that I mentioned earlier. It's likely that we aren't going to get to all the questions today through this session, so I just wanted to make a call out for any follow-ups that are needed or any questions that go unaddressed. I encourage folks to visit the Center for IDEA Fiscal Reporting website at cipher.wested.org. You can click on Contact Us, and that will take you right to our general email at cipher_info@wested.org, or you can go, if you're a Part B or Part C state staff member, you can use the Contact Us page to quickly find your existing TA facilitator, and they'll be able to connect you with the services within Cipher, our partner technical assistance centers, OSEP or OESE. With that housekeeping out of the way, I would now like to turn this over to our first group of presenters from the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, Britt Young and Diane Rentner.
Hello, thanks, Dave. So this afternoon, I'm going to give you an overview of the ESSER and GEAR Use of Funds Frequently Asked Questions document that the department released in May. And then Britt is going to take over and highlight some of the key questions that you may find of interest. So if we can get started with the first slide. I want to have folks kind of get an idea of the terminology we're using here so that we're all on the same page. When we say ESSER, and by the way, that's the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, we mean ESSER under all the iterations. It had funding under the CARES Act, under the SRSA Act, and under the ARP Act. And when we mention GEAR, which is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, we also mean GEAR as it was funded and authorized under the CARES Act and the SRSA Act. So we're talking about all of those programs in one sort of group. And one thing to keep in mind about ESSER in particular is that although there were slightly different uses of funds in each of those acts, the departments determined that all of the uses of funds are available to all the ESSER funding sources. So if something was mentioned in ARP but not in the CARES Act, it is still allowable to use the CARES Act ESSER money for that activity. And one further thing to keep in mind is that the GEAR funds can be used for any of the purposes of the ESSER funds, unless the governor has decided to sort of narrow that to some specific activities. So now that I've outlined these kind of guidelines, we know what we're talking about. Let's get into some specifics. First thing you should know is that the FAQs is a very comprehensive document. It spans over 60 pages and includes 78 questions. There are three sort of overarching purposes that we had. First, obviously, the document highlights how SEAs and LEAs can use the ESSER and GEAR funds. Second, it includes some information on key federal rules and regulations that govern the use of these funds. And finally, the FAQs include some examples of how the funds can be used to safely reopen schools and promote greater equity. And I want to note, although you probably already know this, these funds can be used for any activity authorized under IDEA. Next slide, please. So in creating the FAQs, the department really wanted to highlight and encourage using the funds to safely reopen schools. That is a big priority of the administration, and to get the kids back in safely. They also want to highlight how you can maximize in-person instructional time for all students, and also provide opportunities to address the impacts of lost instructional time that resulted from the pandemic. And so those are sort of like the key things that we hope that states and LEAs would use the funds for right now. But we also want these funds to be used in an equitable manner. The goal would be to focus on the students who have been most impacted by the pandemic, and hopefully that we will emerge stronger on the other side. Next slide. Actually, one back. I'm sorry. I apologize. The FAQs are generally divided into 5 sections. The first one is sort of an overview of the funds. The second section discusses how to open schools safely. The third addresses how educational equity can be advanced as part of state and district responses to the pandemic. The fourth section includes FAQs on how the funds can be used to support educators and other school staff. And the fifth section contains information on fiscal considerations. And then finally, there's a technical appendix that helps states in distributing the funds to LEAs. Next slide. And generally, what we want states and LEAs to do when they're using these funds and making these decisions is there's 3 sort of overarching questions that we want them to consider when they're determining what they want to do. First, is the use of funds intended to prevent, prepare for, or respond to COVID-19, including the impact on the social, emotional, mental health, and academic needs of students? The second question they should ask is, do the uses of funds fall under one of the authorized allowable activities under ESSER or GEAR? And third, is the use of funds permissible under the Uniform Administrative Requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards? In other words, is it necessary and reasonable for the performance of the ESSER or GEAR award? So those are the first three questions. And if there's a no to any one of those, it's likely that that's not an allowable use of funds. But having said that, the department is taking the view that the pandemic was, widely impactful, and so the funds can be used to address a wide range of activities. So there is some considerable flexibility, but we still need to, meet some very general requirements. Next slide, please. And so again, notably, what we want folks to take away is that, the funds can be used for health and safety efforts, including improving ventilation and implementing prevention strategies that are consistent with the CDC guidelines. The funds can also be used to meet the social, emotional, mental health, and academic needs of students. And schools and states are encouraged to allocate these resources in ways that advance equity and ensure that there are adequate funds available to provide opportunities and supports that students need to succeed. And now I'm going to turn it over to Britt, and she's going to hit some of the key FAQs that you might find of interest. Thanks.
Thanks, Diane. Just want to get to the right slide. So as Diane noted, we've divided the FAQs into 5 sections, and the first section is a broad overview of the use of ESSER and GEAR funds. And yeah, okay. Oh, so next slide, please. Thank you. Next slide, please. And then section B, in section B, we address questions around the reopening of schools and promoting health and safety of students, staff, and school community. So what resources are available to support the safe reopening and sustained operation of schools, for example? Next slide. Also, a common question that we receive, back one slide. Thank you. One question that we receive often is around vaccinations. So, in general, yes, vaccinations are allowable. Next slide. Also, popular common questions that we've received are around construction. So B6 responds to the question about whether or not ESSER and GEAR funds can be used for construction. Also, questions, we attempt to address questions about use of funds for renovation, including for improving HVAC systems. Next slide, please. And then the next section, section C, is about how to use these funds to advance educational equity in responding to COVID-19. So what are some of the key considerations that a state and LEA should consider in order to make sure that ESSER and GEAR funds are allocated equitably among schools? Next slide, please. And then again, to address equity considerations, how can an LEA use ESSER and GEAR funds to support students who lost instructional time? How can an LEA use ESSER and GEAR funds to support students' social, emotional, mental health, and academic needs, including by hiring support personnel such as nurses, counselors, and social workers? Next slide, please. We would also hope that these funds are used to focus on student subgroups that are most impacted by the pandemic. So some of these subgroups are subgroups that maybe were having challenges even pre-pandemic. And so the pandemic only exacerbated those challenges. So we would hope that states and school districts would use funds to try to address the needs of underrepresented and also students with additional challenges. So children and youth in foster care, students who are experiencing homelessness, students with disabilities under IDEA, for example, English learners. Next slide, please. We've also been asked questions about whether or not or how states and districts can use ESSER GEAR funds to support high school seniors. So slide, FAQ C17 speaks to that. Next slide, please. In addition, we've had a number of school districts ask about if they can support students who graduated high school in the spring of 2020, and also students who graduated in 2021 now. And yes, we do think that there are ways that you can support this group of students. Next slide, please. In addition, there may be students who became disengaged, and so there are strategies that you might want to use to re-engage students who either were at risk of failing, at risk of dropping out, at risk of leaving school. Next slide, please. And lots of folks have asked about whether or not they can use funds for pre-K or other early childhood programs. So we address how you can do that. The answer is yes, but we urge you to read the whole response. Next slide, please. Again, in this subsection, we want you to consider all sorts of other strategies to address and try to mitigate the impact of COVID-19, especially on special populations. And so there are a lot of additional questions in this section, and we urge you to look through the whole document. Next slide, please. A big question or a set of questions in the next few slides and in section C is around summer learning and enrichment. So we would hope that districts have used funds for summer learning and enrichment activities, and if it's not too late, consider doing that going forward. Next slide, please. And again, this slide also addresses summer learning enrichment. Next slide, please. As does this one. We know that some states and school districts faced or face procurement challenges. So trying to get summer school up and running quickly. In acknowledgement of that, we try to point out how you can do that quickly. Next slide, please. Section D talks about how school districts can support educators and other school staff in order to stabilize the workforce. And so in general, yes, you can use these funds to support and stabilize the educator workforce. Next slide, please. Another question that we've received a lot is whether or not school districts can use these funds to provide premium pay or additional compensation to teachers, principals, other school personnel. And in short, the answer is yes. But again, I urge you to read the entire response. Next slide, please. And then the final section, as Diane pointed out, is a number of frequently asked questions around additional fiscal consideration, including the timelines that states and school districts need to be aware of as they're implementing these programs. Next slide, please. And this slide again addresses timelines. So even though the uses of funds under ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ARP-ESSER are the same, school districts and states need to be aware that the timing, the period of availability is different for each bucket of funding. And next slide, please. And as Diane noted already, the technical appendix provides information to states and school districts about how to make these awards. So next slide, please. With that, we would urge our states and school districts to reach out to their state mailbox if they have any questions about uses of funds, and we work as quickly as we can to respond to these questions. We have a work group that does that. And so I thank you for your time and look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Britt and Diane. That was very informative, and appreciate the presentation just now. I would encourage participants to leave questions in the chat if you would like. We have one question that I think will flow nicely into our next presenter, which is are any of the Part B funds specifically designated for 619 of IDEA? I believe that would be talking about the American Rescue Plan IDEA allocation. So I think we can address that in our next one, but I'll pause and see if Britt or Diane have anything to respond there.
No, I think you're right. I think that's a question to be answered by our colleagues.
Yeah. And just a question that I have in general too, after just hearing this presentation, are there any sort of FAQs that you all have received on the FAQs? In other words, are there any key highlights or areas that you have noted that states may be grappling with in particular with understanding this guidance?
I think their states are very, they want to be careful, and they want to make sure that they're not violating any uses of funds in the statute. And so we get follow-up questions. So around construction, for example, a lot of times states want to give us their specific scenario to make sure that our FAQ actually does apply to them.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Premium pay is another question that we've received a number of follow-up questions about. Great. And again, mostly it's states wanting to give us their specific scenario that's a little different from what we've laid out in the FAQs.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is we don't get a lot of questions about addressing learning loss or things that are sort of more traditional, in the lane for the LEAs and SEAs. So, we I think have a bit of a skewed view sometimes about what the funds are being used for, but I do think we end up getting the questions that are hard for them to understand and know that they're doing things the right way. But my confidence is that they are using the funds to reopen the schools, to address learning loss, and do sort of the things that they are feel strong in, so they don't need to ask us.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks, Diane and Britt. I'm looking at the chat. I'm seeing no additional questions. Appreciate it very much. I'm going to take this time now to transition us to Jennifer Finch from the Office of Special Education Programs. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Dave. All right, and so as Dave said, my name is Jennifer Finch, and I am with the Office of Special Education Programs. And today we are going to be discussing the American Rescue Plan Act as it relates to IDEA Part B and Part C and use of funds. So let's jump right in. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide was developed by Cypher staff, and it gives just an excellent visual representation of the scale of the American Rescue Plan Act funds and that investment. It just depicts the trend of an increasing investment in education, beginning with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act way back in 2009. I think that's what that says, all the way to the American Rescue Plan Act, which is what we have today. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. All right, thank you. The President's budget request for IDEA for fiscal year 2022 is an indication of this continued commitment. So while we're just at the budget request stage, the request itself demonstrates the administration's dedication to high levels of IDEA funding beyond the American Rescue Plan. Next slide, please. And so the overview. As you know, on July 1, the long-awaited American Rescue Plan Act, also known as ARP, I've also heard ARP Act, I've also heard ARPA. They're all the same investment, and from here on out, I'll just say ARP. But we know that Part B and Part C of IDEA authorizes assistance to states to support the provision of special education and related services to children with disabilities and the provision and coordination of early intervention services for infants and toddlers with disabilities and their families, respectively. Section 2014A of the ARP Act provided more than $3 billion in supplemental funding for fiscal year 2021 for the 3 formula grants that you see on your slide. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. So we've got a lot of money to spend here. But before we dive into Part B and Part C uses of funds, I want to spend time with the cross-cutting requirements. So the IDEA ARP Act funds must be used consistently with the current IDEA statutory and regulatory requirements, including the requirements under Part B and Part C, as well as those cross-cutting requirements. And those cross-cutting requirements that are in the OMB Uniform Guidance, EDGAR, and GEPA. So we must remain vigilant as stewards of this investment and also maintain our standards for general supervision as we oversee the use of these funds. So 2 items that I want to bring your attention to on this slide are the period of performance, and I think that might be on the next slide, but the period of performance and also prior approvals. So the ARP Act funds are available for obligation, as you know, from July 1, 2021 to September 30th, 2023, and they must be liquidated then by January 28th, 2024. Next slide, please. And then I think we'll jump back to the previous slide. I think somehow they got out of order, but so let's talk for a minute about prior approvals. And then we'll go back to the previous slide. So under the cost principles of the Uniform Guidance, certain direct costs require prior approval in order to be allowable. So some of the most common prior approval prior approval requests we get at OSEP might be related to budget requests and budget changes, but we do get prior approval requests for general purpose equipment and for construction and alteration of facilities. So each of these direct costs, as you know, has a standard threshold, right? Amount that determines when a state needs to submit a request to OSEP in order to obtain prior approval. So without going into all the nitty-gritty of it, I will say if you need to submit a prior approval request, I would urge you to get in touch with your state lead or connect with your fiscal implementation team folks on your state team. And we will be happy to kind of walk you through the process and walk you through the documentation needed. And as Britt and Diane said earlier, it's fine if you have to talk about your specific situation. I think that helps us help you. So those questions are fine. Can we go back to the previous slide? All right. So let's continue talking about the IDA cost-cutting requirements. So again, as I said earlier, Part B and Part C funds that the ARP Act made available for states, in addition to the IDA Part B and Part C formula grant awards for fiscal year 2021, are all subject to the statutory requirements, right? And to those cost-cutting requirements. So for Part C in particular, and we'll talk about Part B a little later, but for Part C in particular, this means that the funds must be used, as an example, as a payer of last resort to supplement state funds for the maintenance of effort requirements. So let's talk now about some Part C use of funds. The cost principles apply here. When we talk about use of funds, the cost principles contained under Subpart E of the Uniform Guidance apply to both IDA and ARP Act funds. And that's the one thing that you have to remember. And as Diane said it, they must be reasonable, necessary, and allocable. And she mentioned that earlier. So keep that in mind as we talk through use of funds. So although the same statutory and regulatory requirements apply, it's important to remember that these funds are short-term. So as my colleague, Susan Kaufman, and I, kind of prepared for this presentation, one of the things that she likes to impart is that the funds are short-term and states should consider using the funds for activities and initiatives that reap long-term benefits and are sustainable. So keep that in mind when you think through how to use the funds and what you'll use them for. So think short-term investment reaping long-term benefit. And keep that in mind as we talk through, and that applies to Part B and Part C. So as just some examples of the use of funds for Part C, they may be used for any allowable purposes, including and just not limited to, but I have some examples, the direct provision of early intervention services to infants and toddlers with disabilities and their families, implementing statewide comprehensive coordinated multidisciplinary interagency system to provide early intervention services, improving the use of technology to deliver Part C services, and improving the use of teleintervention by early intervention service providers. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so let's talk about Part B. And as you know, when we talk about Part B, we talk about 611 as well as 619 funds, right? So as mentioned earlier, all Part B ARP funds must be used consistently with the current IDA Part B statutory and regulatory requirements. And those are for all the fiscal requirements that you see on your screen. And so the requirements that surround state administration and other state level activities remains the same. And what I would urge you here is to look at 300-704B-4, and there's Roman numeral 1 through 11 that gives a list of suggested list of categories for the uses of those funds. And also there was a bump in the 619 allocation, and there was a question earlier about designated 619 funds. And so this is one of those areas where in that bump up, you can use those funds for, consistently with the Part B requirements. LEA allocations. By now you've received both GANs, and for your regular Part B and the additional ARP Act funds. I would urge you to ensure that your GANs meet the federal award identification requirements. And those can be found in the Uniform Guidance 200-332A1. we have made fiscal findings and have sustained audit findings around these areas. So I would take a look at those requirements and just to make sure that your GANs contain that information. In terms of use of funds, again, I can't reiterate this enough, but funds may be used for allowable purposes under Part B, and they're all subject to the requirements in IDEA and under EDGAR, GEPA, and the Uniform Guidance. But in thinking about the use of the funds, I would consider what is needed to meet the needs of students with disabilities. And also, just as I did with Part C, some examples of what you can use the funds for might be assisting LEAs in personnel training needs, addressing evaluation backlogs resulting from school closures, and particularly for 619, and as you know, for Part B, 619 funds are used for preschool students ages 3 to 5. You can also assess LEAs meeting personnel shortages and the training needs for preschool staff as well. And similarly, 619 ARP Act funds can be used for early childhood and implementing child find policies and procedures, including ensuring the identification, location, and evaluation of children who may need special education and related services. But that's just, I mean, that's not an exhaustive list, but I would also point you to question C5 of the ESSER and GEAR FAQs that Diane and Britt talked about. So C5 contains a list of use of funds that apply to ARP Act as well. So that begins on page 31, and it's not an exhaustive list, but it gives you some ideas. So I would refer to that as well. So the MFS requirements, as you know, those remain in play and have not been like blanketly waived. But the department is authorized to waive the MFS requirement for a state for one particular year at a time and under particular circumstances. So that has not changed. And we've got a lot of information on that on our website. But if you have questions about it, I would refer you to Cypher or to your fiscal implementation team. We're happy to take questions if you have any, as it relates to MFS. In terms of the LEA MOE requirement, again, the requirement is still in play and has not been waived. And we do know that talking about LEA MOE can be a 90-minute presentation in and of itself as we get into the nuts and bolts. But what's important for me to impart to you is that SEAs have to maintain oversight and be vigilant in ensuring that the requirements are met. Again, going back to the general supervision requirements and maintaining the integrity and ensuring that the requirements are being met. The other thing that we do know is that in accordance with IDEA and in any fiscal year, that an LEA's subgrant allocation exceeds the amount that the LEA received in the previous year, that LEA may reduce their level of local and state and local expenditures by up to 50%. So newsflash, this is that time. But I want to remind you that there are certain criteria that govern that eligibility. And one of those are LEA annual determinations made under IDEA. And of course, if an SEA determines that an LEA is not meeting the requirements of Part B, the SEA must prohibit that LEA from reducing its maintenance of effort. So I would again urge you to maintain the integrity of your determinations and also remind you that you will need to monitor and track the use of the freed up funds. And secondly, if an SEA has taken responsibility for providing FAPE in the LEA because that LEA is unable to establish and maintain programs of FAPE. And then lastly, of course, if an LEA is required to reserve 15% because significant disproportionality has been identified under 300-646. Under those circumstances, those three circumstances govern eligibility. So again, this is where your general supervision responsibilities kind of kick in as you provide oversight and also maintain integrity of your determinations. And then CEIS, CCEIS, and equitable services. And in the interest of time, I'll kind of lump those three together. Those requirements are still the same. And what I will say is the amounts are determined from the total FFY 2021 funds. And again, we've got a lot of information on our website, and Cypher has some slides at the end of this presentation. I would also direct you to Cypher if you have questions regarding any of those. And also we are working on additional information and guidance regarding the use of ARP Act funds. So look for that to be coming out soon. And I will now turn you over to our moderator, Dave.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. That sounds great. I'm looking in the chat now, and I do not see any additional questions that have been passed through. I believe you addressed the 619 specific
Yes.
Part B funds, so thank you.
Yes.
Just in a couple of minutes that we have before we transfer to Alabama, are there any areas you've seen so far? You mentioned some of the monitoring and audit work that's been happening. Are there any areas so far that seem particularly challenging from your perspective for states that might be worth hearing about again?
I think not so far, not particularly challenging, but I know that we are getting a lot of questions regarding prior approvals. So
Gotcha.
Folks are thinking about how to use those funds. We know that we're going to get a lot of prior approval requests coming in. And again, I would urge you to contact us and reach out to your state lead and have a conversation with us. And you can talk specifics about what you're thinking, you know what I mean? And we can talk about it and discuss what the prior approval request should look like, what documentation you'll need to submit and things like that.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Another question that just came into the chat. Since the Part C extension of the State Improvement Grant is included in the APR GAN this year, do you have any guidance for keeping expenditures separate if needed?
I do not. I can't think of any right at this moment. And honestly, my Part C counterpart is not with me as I present, but we can definitely get more information to you regarding that Part C extended option.
Yeah, okay. Great, thanks, Jennifer. And again, I would just invite folks, feel free to reach out to the Center for IDA Fiscal Reporting or your OSEP state contact for more information on that specific question. And would be happy to go into the details there a little bit further. So I'm going to stop here. I see one other question in the chat. So whoever this participant is on transportation costs, and we'll try to circle back to that at the end of our time. I think there'll be might be some good information coming up about this as well. So that said, I'm going to now transition us to our Alabama Part C program team, Amy Blakeney, Felicia Carswell, Brandy Brown, and Tanya Gandy, who have all joined us in a room today. So appreciate that very much. And thank you, Alabama, for your preparation and willingness to share today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave. Like you said, I'm Amy Blakeney. I'm the director for the Alabama Early Intervention System. Newly director. Most of you, if you knew anything about Alabama, you knew Betsy Prince. She retired in the middle of the pandemic, and when we returned to work on October 1st in our offices, that was my first day as the director for Alabama. So lots happening in Alabama. We've got our plates full right now. So what I'm going to do is kind of give you an overview along with two of my colleagues and give you an overview of what Alabama Part C is kind of planning with the ARP funds. We're kind of in the middle of our planning phase, but just to kind of give you an overview of where we are and where we are headed. So next slide. Next, thank you. Looking at our critical information, we have been in lots of collaboration. We are very blessed to have University of Alabama as our evaluation team and one of our great stakeholders. So we have been collaborating with them ever since we found that we were going to receive some funds. We have approached them and had some meetings to gain their input through a statewide survey that Felicia's going to talk to you a little bit later about. We have acquired information from OSEP, from Cypher, and other national TA centers. And we've also informed our state ICC as well as our lead agency, Alabama Department of Rehabilitation Services board members and other state subcommittees and in our whole decision-making process. So next slide. Part C, talking about our short-term needs. When the pandemic first hit, we were informed by the governor that we would need to address that. We would need to go home, stop what we're doing, and go home. We engaged we began engaging our stakeholders, our main stakeholders, like our state partners, Department of Mental Health, as well as Alabama Institute for Deaf and Blind. We would meet 2 to 3 times a week via Zoom to discuss the COVID-19 implications. Based on the governor's direction, CDC and Alabama Department of Public Health, a guidance document was created and disseminated to all of our early intervention programs throughout the state. The guidance document with an FAQ was updated weekly. So we were constantly meeting to actually create a guidance document for our EI programs, as well as continuing to update it on a weekly basis. So we kept them very informed. Luckily, with that collaboration that we had, our services never stopped for families. So that's something that Alabama is very proud of. Even though we were at home, our services never stopped being delivered to our families. EI programs reported internet access issues through the process with some families that dealt with money, location, data, and internet services. And as a result of those issues that were reported, an electronic survey was developed for families to identify their specific needs. So we sent that survey out. We did lots of surveys through this whole pandemic. And so based on the results of that survey, we were able to secure equipment, smartphones with hotspots. We were able to secure those and purchase them for families in need, and are continuing to do that as of this day. Medicaid provided information for Alabama to continue receiving reimbursement for services through teleintervention with the CPT codes specific to COVID-19. That happened probably the first week that we were quarantined and were sent home. They worked very diligently to get those codes out to us so that we could continue to provide those services through teleintervention and also be able to be reimbursed for it. With the use of our database system, we were able to continually monitor our number of referrals, new IFSPs, and services being delivered on an ongoing basis. And we were also able to use this data and pre-COVID-19 data to determine the effects of how it was affecting Alabama. Next slide, please. Looking at some of the long-term effects, I think I missed a couple of things on the short term, but nothing that I didn't already mention. I think I mentioned it already, even though it was in my notes. So Part C long-term needs, we were asked by Alabama Medicaid to submit a formal request to continue teleintervention that included the pros and cons of its use. So we created a task force group that consisted of our state office staff, as well as stakeholders out in the field with our programs, to actually put this document together as a formal request to Medicaid. We submitted that. We created it with all of our stakeholders, and we have. The Alabama has decided to continue the use of teleintervention as a mode of service delivery, whether we receive the feedback from Medicaid or not. We have not yet received information from Medicaid. We're still awaiting that. I think they're probably going to wait until they are no longer going to allow us to use the COVID-19 codes before they actually give us the final say-so on whether or not we can continue to be reimbursed. In addition to our multi-weekly staff meetings, we continued with our trainings virtually. That consisted of our routines-based interview trainings, our routine-based home visiting trainings, our interagency coordinating council. We did virtually and continue to do virtually. Our financial planning subcommittees and all of our various conferences have and continue to be held virtually. Through the use of virtual, we have found that so many more people have been able to attend our ICC meetings and our subcommittee meetings because they don't have to travel. And it takes an hour to 2 hours out of their day. They can join virtually and then they can go back to work. So we actually plan to continue, even when we go back in person for our ICC meetings, we do plan to have that as a tool, as a platform for people across the state to be able to continue to join in those meetings. So those are the fact that we've been able to continue all of our meetings, trainings, and conferences has, like I said, it has increased our overall participation. Let's see. And I'm going to turn it over to Felicia Carswell, who's going to talk to you about the ARP funds and our first steps and kind of where we are. Thank you.
Hi, I am Felicia Carswell. I am the Assistant Part C Director for Alabama. So I'm going to start on the next slide. I'm going to talk about the ARP funds, what we consider the first steps. And one of the main things that we learned during this process is making sure that we obtain our stakeholder input. When we first knew about receiving these additional funds, the first thing we needed to know, of course, was the money part. So we were able to receive $2.9 million, which is a great amount. And also at the same time, wondering how we was going to put all of this into place with the timeframes that we had. So we immediately began to go to various TA centers through our virtual meetings. We actually acquired information from OSEP, from CIFER and other national TA centers, and we were able to bring that information back to our state ICC, our lead agency board members, and other state subcommittees, such as our public awareness subcommittees, our financial planning subcommittees, and personnel prep subcommittees. So all of our subcommittees, we were able to bring them into the input part. One of the things that we also talked about here at the state office was how we were going to get that input. And we collaborated with the University of Alabama, Birmingham, their evaluation team, to be able to help us gain that input from stakeholders. And one of the things that we learned through going through the pandemic is that Everybody now was using their technology, whether that was going through emails or whether using social media. So we used that avenue as a way to make sure that we got our information out, because we definitely wanted this stakeholder input about how to use this money, or what we consider them dreaming big, thinking big, and looking at various things that we have in place and how we can enhance those things to make sure that we're able to provide services and continue to provide services to our family and children. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we did was we, with the help of the University of Alabama, Birmingham, they were able to send out a survey question. Our survey question was very, very broad enough so they can put all the information that they wanted. We kind of gave them a little things as far as examples of what we could possibly use it for, but we wanted them to let us know how they felt like we should use that money. And as you can see right here on this slide, that we were able to just ask the question, this is your opportunity to dream big. Keep in mind a few criteria, and considering the criteria, share how would you like to see these funds spent. We were able to get some good information, thinking outside of what we consider the box, and we got good feedback because we have about 43 EI programs through the state. And so being able to get that feedback from them in a timely manner, and also making sure that we include them in that part of the survey. And I'm going to turn that part over to my coworker, Brandy Brown, who will be discussing the results of that survey and how we plan to use those funds. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brandy Brown, and I'm the Early Intervention Contracts, Grants, and Training Specialist here for Part C in the state of Alabama. And on our next slide here, you can see that the Alabama Part C online survey was asked, and it was a very broad question. We did ask programs to keep sustainability in mind. So our results, if you will go to the next slide, our results based on the input of the stakeholder survey that we sent out with the collaboration of the University of Alabama, we had several needs that were identified. The first need that you can see here is education and training. And some of the things that were specifically mentioned under this component were staff training on child development, staff training on evaluation tools, training that was related to autism and infant early childhood mental health, self-paced training modules, and also things such as a learning management system to be able to support ongoing training and coaching. Under employee support, some of the things that were mentioned were things such as financial signing and retention bonuses. There were mentions of district or program vehicles. Also, programs were interested in having the money split up between each individual program. As Felicia said, we have 43 early intervention programs within the state. And then things were mentioned about being able to purchase PP&E and sanitation supplies. For family support, they were interested in being able to establish family resource centers locally, such as a lending library, being able to offer learning materials and even public awareness materials. And then for technology, there were things mentioned such as database for electronic documentation and specifically technology equipment. This equipment was supposed to be used for families and also for families, in addition to that, for providers, so that they had updated technology to be able to reach out to the families. Under some of the miscellaneous things that were mentioned, there was an increase in partnerships with other agencies, the routines-based interview coaches and routines-based home visiting coaches to be able to increase the capacity in that effort that we have, and things such as staff mental health counseling and support. So taking all of these things into consideration and being able to keep sustainability in mind, it was important for us to be able to look ahead into this time span that we have and make sure that we're able to take all of the stakeholder input and considerations into place. And some of the preliminary things that we are currently looking at using the funds for do include recruitment and retention of EI personnel, of course, training statewide, and a statewide campaign to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in all aspects of early intervention. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to our moderator, Dave. And that's all for Alabama Part C.
Great. Thank you, Brandy, Felicia, and Amy. Really appreciated the presentation there, and the innovations there, I think, in terms of assessing the stakeholder needs and really trying to understand what your local agencies were thinking in terms of primary needs and then reacting accordingly. I'm looking for questions in the chat, and I'm currently not seeing any. Just in a couple minutes that we have left with Alabama, if we could have Felicia and Amy, this would be for the three of you, I guess, just a general question. If there's room to sit, or we can have whoever, I'll just throw this out as, I think just if you could go back, you mentioned all the different adjustments that you had to make over the last year during this pandemic, and it's kind of amazing to hear that story about going, just remembering even myself. I think maybe a lot of people remember getting centered on having to sort of go home all at once. Of all the things that you've done in the last year regarding process for the use of ARP funds, is there anything that you would do differently if you had to rewind and go back, that you were just that you might take another look at?
Are you talking about as far as when we went home? Would we do anything differently?
Yeah, no, just in terms of engaging with the American Rescue Plan funds.
I can't think of anything. We're still in the process, so it's still a work in progress for us. But we continue to engage our stakeholders and go back to the table. There will be some things that we'll take everything into consideration. Some things we can't do with the money that people have asked for, but we did ask them to dream big and that we would take everything into consideration. And so far, I think with what we have written down on paper, I think that we're doing some great things. We still have a ways to go. One thing that we're really going to be concentrating on is a statewide campaign for the diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm very proud of that piece of it. So we're going to really focus on statewide for that. And I think probably we're going to be able to hopefully give all of our early intervention programs some additional money to actually purchase some needed equipment, technology for families so that they can continue to receive services virtually if they're wanting to do that. Maybe a blend of services that we're looking at. But we are, we're all on board with the tele-intervention as needed. In no way does it take the place of being in the homes, and we will always, that will always be our first and foremost. But it's a great way to be able to serve families who have really high risk needs at home, where a child has a lot of needs and does not want to be exposed to the community. Or have someone come into their home. So that's something that we are really concentrating on as well. So we have a lot of good ideas and things that we're hoping to do with this money. We're going to put a lot of money toward our autism initiative. We've done some great things with that. And I know that even with our national group. So those are things that we're concentrating on. I can't think of anything we would do different, because anytime that you're engaging families, and all of your stakeholders, I think that you can't go wrong with that. So
fantastic. Thank you again, Amy, Felicia, and Brandy. Really appreciate the presentation, and I think just many of the things you were just mentioning, Amy, I think may be inspirational for many of your colleagues and those folks in the field that are thinking about using the ARP funds. So really appreciate it. So thank you all very much for the presentation today. And I would now like to transition to a Part B perspective from the Kansas State team. We have Dean Zeiss and Christy Weiler. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And with 2 warm bodies in the room, this is actually the biggest conference I've been to in the last year and a half. So get vaccinated. It's great to be back in person. And you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. So we want to talk a little bit about the Part B perspective of supporting districts and really that challenge of going from a drought to a flood, that challenge of managing what is an impermanent surge to near adequate funding. Because again, even at these higher levels, we are still not at the full 40% funding level for IDEA. So next slide, please. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about how we talk about the additional funding and how we've managed it here in Kansas and with our districts. So first, we really do try to be explicit in how we identify both the additional IDEA aid that was made available by the American Rescue Plan that was passed back in March, and making a distinction between that and some of this other ESSER aid, whether that is through the CARES Act, CARISA, or ARP, that can also be used for IDEA services, but is not IDEA aid. And those distinctions really do make a difference in both planning, accountability, flexibility, and reporting. Next slide, please. So in Kansas, as we are talking about how we talk about these funds and really share them out with the public and with our districts, one of the just basic things that we've done is to talk about the ARP IDEA funds as IDEA funds. The slide in front of you, we don't expect you to actually read everything that's on that slide, but if you do want to go to that QR code or to the link that's included, or just visit to the KSD website on the finance page of the special education portion, we really have tried to include the full breakout of the current 21-22 IDEA awards that includes both the regular IDEA flow through, including the breakouts for proportionate share for equitable services, which we do calculate for our districts here at the state level based on LEA data that they provide, as well as the ARP IDEA portion, and really driving home for our districts that while this does have a separate CFDA number and is tracked separately, these are IDEA funds. Next slide, please. But as we are planning for how to use all of these new IDEA funds, it is sometimes important to start with the hard truths, because while in some ways this current situation is a little bit like that, like the story of the monkey paw and the monkey paw wish, where someone wished for increased IDEA funding and they got their wish, but they got all the funding at once and they only have 2 years to spend it. And so going into this next year of 21-22 and beyond, our districts, there's no doubt that they need these resources. But in many ways, it is a perfect storm to miss local maintenance of effort or to find yourself in a situation of dangerous long-term consequences where you're not able to sustain what you've built. Everything from the additional IDEA funding, which again, this is great, but it's additional IDEA funding. We've got multiple other federal funding streams that are feeding into special education and the other aspects of education within the districts. And we have these short time frames. We have erratic patterns of enrollment and service plans, generally, not just talking for special education. And we have staff turnover at both the administrative level and in the classroom. All of these things together introduce so much unpredictability that even for our veteran directors, it will be a challenge to meet maintenance of effort and to continue services after the surge. So as we are helping our districts understand and prepare for and strategically plan for the use of these funds, the first thing we always start with is these hard truths of, first and foremost, there have been no extraordinary waivers that are available to reduce state maintenance of fiscal support. There is, of course, the existing waiver option that is already in IDEA, and I think Jennifer and maybe some others spoke a little bit about that earlier, but that's really for some pretty specific conditions that, at least for our state, we're probably not in a position to be able to utilize that option. And having been a state that formerly only got a partial MFS waiver after the ERA period, we can say firsthand that it's a high bar to get a waiver like that, and it really is not something that should be planned on unless you really have all your I's dotted and T's crossed. Second, and for our districts, that local level, there is no extraordinary waivers available to reduce local maintenance of effort, period. Now, Congress has, we've told our districts is Congress has had at least 3 opportunities from the CARES Act to CRRSA to ARP where they could have chosen to include additional provisions here if they wanted to. Certainly for CRRSA and ARP, it was certainly on their minds and they discussed it. But in both instances, they have chosen not to do that. And the Kansas Department of Education and the U.S. Department of Education, neither one of us have the authority to grant any sort of extraordinary waivers beyond what's already in the law. And then finally, we talk about at this time, there's no additional waivers to extend the period of availability for the funds. So with all of those caveats in mind, and we really try to tell our districts to really focus within those rules, because this is one place where we do just constantly get questions and such, and folks that really are hoping and think surely there's going to be something that will come along and a white knight that's going to come and give us some flexibilities, but that's just not what we've seen in the past, and at this point we need to operate with the facts that we have. Next slide, please. So, and kind of in that same breath, I want to talk a little bit about our lessons from the past, because many of our current local administrators and state policymakers, many of them still kind of discount that possibility of missing state maintenance of fiscal support or even local maintenance of effort because they weren't here the last time that this really came about. However, while in Kansas, we have not had a district miss maintenance of effort in at least the last 10 years. But that wasn't always the case. And if we look back to the last period that there was a surge of districts that missed maintenance of effort and that did have to repay funds, it was immediately following the injection of ERA aid back in the 2009, 10, 11 period. And then again, just due to turnover, a lot of our local administrators simply weren't around to experience those consequences. So we're having to really reteach a lot of these lessons. So let's go on to the next slide. So we've talked a little bit about the doom and gloom, but let's maybe talk a little bit now about so what tools and resources are we providing our districts to help them navigate this challenging opportunity. So when we work with our districts and speak to them, a lot of times where we start is with the thought of first focus on identifying what are those additional one-time costs and investments that really would help your students with disabilities and your special education program. And for many of them, that might be, whether that is investing in, some of those things that maybe have been on the would have been nice list, but now you actually have the resources to do it, whether that is specialized playground equipment for particular students or particular vehicle modifications for a particular student or students, as well as other types of larger investments in professional development or other grow your own kind of programs. Those big one-time costs that will have long-term benefits, but because our districts have been receiving ESSER aid and other federal aid for over a year now, beginning with the CARES Act, some of these things were already addressed back with CARES and some of the other federal funds. So it's getting more and more difficult to find items that are really only special education that they can utilize the funds for. So as we're thinking about other pressure relief valves for our LEAs to still utilize these resources in a way that is meaningful and effective within their districts, we do present some other options to them. Everything from the voluntary 15% set aside for coordinated early intervening services, which I have to point out is not something a lot of our districts are particularly keen on, because unlike the mandatory set aside for significant disproportionality for CCEIS, voluntary CEIS can only benefit students who have not been identified as students with disabilities, which does pose a lot of issues for our districts. But then separately, another one that we do try to point out that we are exploring in a little bit more detail is the consolidation with ESEA at a building level. Given our time constraints, we're not diving deep into any of these, but we are including the citations. I'm sure that folks can follow up, and of course we've got the Center for IDEA Fiscal Reporting is helping put this on, and I'm sure Dave and the rest of them would be happy to support districts with any questions they would have around these. But this one is one that we think does have a lot of potential, because it does allow a portion of your IDEA funds to be consolidated into ESEA funds and potentially serve all students in a more holistic environment, in a way that disproportionately positively impacts students with disabilities and allows you to provide truly inclusive intervention services. And then, of course, the normal exceptions that are already allowable through the maintenance of effort. Next slide, please. We also want to call out in particular some of the challenges around the largest of the large one-time improvements, the capital improvement costs. And I think that for us in Kansas, probably like most states, this is uncharted territory for us and for our districts. Previous to all of these additional CARES, CARISA, and ARP funds, whether that's ESSER or ARP IDA, prior to that, most federal funds in Kansas went towards personnel costs or other services. Very little, if any, was expended on property, let alone equipment or capital improvements. And in this last category, the capital improvements, that poses the biggest challenges, because there was so little knowledge at the local level of the practical implications of utilizing these funds for these services, and even the state capacity at our level of how to manage requests beyond what was just explicitly called out in the law. Over the course of the last just couple of months, really I guess last 6 months, there has been a lot of effort and time put into ramping up these services and resources. And now, if go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And so now, for our districts, we do have a suite of resources on what's required for both the prior approval and then the subsequent requirements around these capital improvements, including construction, which, like our other resources, you can access by either using that QR code or visiting our link, or visiting the Federal Disaster and Pandemic Relief page on the KSDE website. And at that link, you'll find resources that include both a short, I think it's a 4 or 7 page overview of just the main requirements around using any federal funds, any federal education funds for capital improvements, including construction, as well as examples of the form that we've developed for prior approval that our districts now complete, and links to resources including a webinar and FAQ that are available on our website. So I think with that, next slide. Yep, we're going to turn it back over to Dave.
Great, thanks very much, Dean and Christy. Really appreciated that presentation. And I will again ask our audience to post any questions to the discussion, and then they'll be filtered through here. And not seeing any now. And so we have about 10 minutes left. There's I think I can call out a couple of questions that have come across throughout the presentation and just call out individuals to respond to those. Christy and Dean, while I have you, we just had a question come through. Have LEAs been encouraged to use funding to support families to receive enhanced resources and training to ensure their children are receiving FAPE?
So, good question. And one of the, I would say, so for not even just for our IDA funds, but for the ESSER funds as well, more generally, community and family engagement has been a high priority. And at a state level, additional investments have been made not just by our SCA, but by other entities that work in this world, have been working with some of the state providers to help build the capacity of supporting families and parents. Sorry, I'm trying to read chat. I shouldn't try to read chat while I'm answering a question, because that never works out well. But yeah, so but that is absolutely something that we've been encouraging, but I don't have any specific examples to share at this time.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Dean and Christy, again, really appreciate it for the great presentation. And again, thank you to all of our panelists today who have put in a tremendous lift to get this thing put together in the last couple of weeks and work together on this new presentation platform that I believe is new to everyone here. So in the time that we have left, a couple outstanding questions, and I think I can turn these over to Jennifer Finch from OSEP. There's two Part B questions. Jennifer, do you want me to read the questions, or do you want to read them? Do you have them? I can.
You can read them.
Okay. Yeah. Let me see if I can do this. Yeah. So here's a question, and I think Dean alluded to this directly in his presentation just now. But the sudden ceasing of transportation costs and delays in related services due to restrictions on in-person services reduced the overall cost of special education for LEAs in the last year. Will there be any consideration, exceptions, waivers implemented to the LEA maintenance of effort requirements?
So I can say that no, there will be no exceptions or additional waivers as it relates to LEA MOE. And I would urge you to review the regulations and the allowable exceptions as they exist at 300-204.
Great.
We also have on our website, there is also still posted that FAQ on LEA MOE, and it was dated July 27th, 2015, and that's still available for folks to take a look at as well.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Jennifer. And the next question here is, I'm trying to truncate this question. I don't know if I can to capture the full context. But if an LEA has already completed a meaningful consultation with non-public schools related to the initial award and proportionate share calculation of its FFY21 IDEA Part B funds, is the LEA required to complete another meaningful consultation with a supplemental award for IDEA Part B 611 and 619, and thus document another meeting? Or does the initial meaningful consultation done with the original allocation meet the requirement? And that was for Jennifer.
Yes.
Oh, there we go. Yes, there you are. Okay.
I started talking. Okay. So yes, additional consultation may be required. And so depending on how your state's consultation process is set up, we've seen that some states have an ongoing consultation process. But either way, the LEAs have to consult and determine how the proportionate share of IDA ARP funds will be expended. So if you've done it already, I would say, yes, you have to do it again. But some states may be able to work it into their ongoing consultation process.
Gotcha.
And I apologize, we didn't get, some of these topics can be, again, presentations in and of itself. But we wanted to kind of cover as much ground as we could. So it was difficult getting into everything, but I do appreciate your questions. And the Part C question, I want to say we will have to get back to you on that. I feel like the Wizard of Oz, you know, and behind me on my cell phone, we're discussing the answer. And so we'll just have to get back to you with that one. I believe it was a question about the budgets for the Part C extended option.
Great. I was just going to say,
Yeah.
Jennifer, right, the Part
Yeah.
C extension of the state improvement grant included in the.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Great. Okay, thank you. We just have a few more minutes. I would invite participants to continue to last chance live to answer any or pose any questions to our panelists. I will continue to look for those. In the interim, just to close us out here, if we could go to, I believe is the third to the last slide in the presentation, and I can walk through a little bit of how to contact the Center for IDEA Fiscal Reporting. Great. Yeah, go back to, please. Yeah, so as I mentioned at the very top of the call, the Center for IDEA Fiscal Reporting supports both Part B and Part C programs around IDEA fiscal requirements. We don't cover all the requirements. We collaborate frequently with other TA centers to help connect states with the supports they need when they need them. And given the nature of this presentation, rather than list everybody, one of the things we do, we'll often work with states to sort of broker questions to the most appropriate resource. So if one thing as a follow-up from this to remember, if you're not already engaged with us, if you go to the website, cipher.wested.org, click on Contact Us, and you can either put a question to our general email again, which is cipher_info@wested.org, or if you're a Part C or Part B state staff member, feel free to. In fact, I very much encourage you to reach out to your state TA liaison or TA facilitator. They have a pretty good understanding of your state already and would stand ready to help. In addition to reaching out to us directly, once you're engaged with us, we have a number of communities of practice. We have a private listserv separate for both Part C and Part B staff to communicate with colleagues in sort of a safe environment to ask questions. We have a number of webinars coming up both for Part B and Part C, as well as we've been working in Part B for a number of years now. We just started working in Part C in the last year. We have a number of new resources coming up relevant to many of the things we talked about use of funds today over the next few months. So look forward to those, and we'll be disseminating those tools as they become available. So I'll pause there and to say, Jennifer Finch just tells me she got the answer to the Part C question in real time. So Jennifer, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I apologize for interrupting. But so yes, in terms of the Part C extended option, it should be budgeted separately. And because it's on a separate budget, you should be able to track the use of those funds, and you should be able to perform budget expenditure comparisons.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. And last one here. So this is another Part C question. And again, Jennifer, this might not be an easy answer, but I will ask it, and then we can follow up as needed. How detailed does OSEP expect us to be with the submission of our Section 3 of our grant application associated with the ARP funds?
And again, I'm not sure that we can answer that question at this time. I am pretty sure that we will be putting out more information as it relates to those budgets and what's expected.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. And that's we're just running to the bottom of the half hour here. So I wanted to sincerely thank all of our panelists again: Britt, Diane, Jennifer, Amy, Felicia, Brandy, Dean, and Christy. well done. Thank you again for putting together a great session today. Really appreciate it. A lot of information shared today, much of it informative and much of it innovative, especially from Alabama and Kansas. So really appreciate it. So that brings us to a close. You can feel free to follow up at the Cypher website with any additional questions that went unanswered today. And hope everyone enjoys the rest of their week and the Leadership Conference. Thank you very much.